Thank you. Appreciate it, John. So I've been I think it's been a little while since I did a Docker Meetup presentation. But I actually am one of the organizers for Docker Chicago. We also got the Docker Milwaukee meetup going, as well as Madison. So, and Nick Schultz really is the driving force in Milwaukee and Madison now with our meetups, and just does a fantastic job in some presentations. So I have been involved in working with Docker for a while. In fact, about a year ago, I published a book, Mastering Docker Enterprise. And so what I'm talking about today has very little to do with anything in the book other than working with Docker. So sort of on a daily basis, whether I'm a DevOps or a developer, and how the world's changing, and it's pretty cool, quite honestly. And I started working with variations of the setup I'm going to talk about today. Gosh, probably a year and a half, 2 years, probably 2 years ago at this point, with the original release of Windows Subsystem for Linux. And now we're looking at WSL 2, and then also with running Docker Desktop, but in a VM, and actually exposing essentially the Docker port so that I could get to it from my Linux VM. So that actually was pretty cool. There were some bumps in there with some file things, file mounts, etc. So the request came in, and when I'm working with groups, sort of in my day job, I have people asking about this. So this was just a lot of fun to start talking about and sharing a little bit. So what I did is just kind of give a little bit of a guided tour, a little bit of a discussion about it. And so I'm going to do a little sleight of hand here and switch over to actually a browser, and you'll find out in a few minutes why I'm doing this trick. I'm actually running the presentation just in a browser, using something called Reveal.js, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But so tonight, just again sharing some of my thoughts, experience, and with Docker Desktop, Windows Subsystem for Linux 2, and VS Code, and these make a really kind of a cool combination. So the first thing I always like to back up and ask a little bit about would be, kind of who's using this. So what is the kind of the target for this kind of setup? And there are fundamentally two. First one on a developer. So if I'm going to put this in a pseudo user story sense, so if you're not already reading that, right? So I'm a developer. I have to use Windows 10 because of my environment, etc. And I need Linux development environments so that I can build and test Linux containers, right? So that's fair. But getting a little more cynical, I need a bash shell that doesn't suck so I can go on living. So these get a little bit, increasingly desperate. And then I need, Linux experience on Windows so I can be as productive without having to buy a MacBook Pro or talking my company into getting me one, and then dealing with all of the management of it. And a lot of organizations have figured out, sort of how to work on it. But I'll tell you, I work with a number of large organizations that still struggle. So, where the Mac platform is still looked at as a large exception. So this I think is pretty timely. And then from a DevOps engineer perspective, I want to be able to take and test deployments. I want to be able to run them on my local development machine in a way that simulates how the pipeline is going to work and how things are going to be deployed in my target environment. So I want to be able to do this locally, and then what I want to be able to do is connect to a remote cluster, potentially, and either deploy to it, try out some of my deployments before I move to something like Helm, etc., or however I'm doing my pipeline, just to make sure that things are there and they work, kind of a dry run, be able to go through that. And then other thing, if folks that are working in the DevOps space and in the container world end up doing is you end up with these utility clusters, right? So these are the ones that, for instance, my centralized logging, I run in a cluster, and I don't run it in my application cluster. And again, the reason if there's an issue with my applications running, I want to be able to look at the logs. So if there's a cluster-related problem, I couldn't get to my logs if they're all in the same thing. So I don't put all my eggs in one basket. And in doing that, I usually have, again, this utility cluster. It may have some build machines that are, the either minion or minion slave runners for builds. So I want to be able to get to those and manage those easily. And so, and then finally, again, I want to be able to, a key thing that's sort of tough to do on a Mac is to be able to build Windows containers and be able to go through and simulate things. So as a DevOps engineer, that level of versatility of being able to do both from your workstation is an important feature. So again, this great new option. So why is this a new option? As I pointed, I've been using it a while, but what's new about it is the level of integration between really the Linux side of the world and how it's implemented, and it's with the Windows side of the world, and how those two, and really that starts with the Windows subsystem for Linux, how it's designed. It gets into a variety of other pieces with the desktop for the Docker desktop, as well as VS Code. So we'll walk through this in a little bit more detail, and then really kind of get into some Q&A stuff. So the 3 essential ingredients we start looking at. So Windows Dev is I've got to be able to do Windows development, of course, but primarily the big gripes come in with Linux and being able to work with a real Linux kernel. So not some simulation, not something that's going to have some kind of weird file system that doesn't work right, or I have to mess around with some metadata to get it to signal updates and things like that. The other thing is containers and Kubernetes built in. I don't want to be screwing around with that stuff. I just want it to work. So I want it to be updated regularly. I want to not have to figure out, which distribution. Am I running Kind? Am I running Minikube and keeping that up to date? And then also the experience from the code editor for my environment to be able to do things has to be pretty deep and rich. And also, if I'm new, particularly to Kubernetes and Docker, I want some prompts. I want some kind of visual things to help me work in my environment. And the other thing, of course, because of our cloud native bent toward things and really open solutions and community-based things, I'm hoping they're free-ish. And I say free-ish, that fact that I do have to pay for Windows, right? But it's pretty nominal, and you're not talking about adding on a bunch of expenses for any of the tooling I'm going to show you today. So talking a little bit about it. So for Windows Subsystem for Linux, this is really the core that's making this possible. And so coming out in the coined as the 20H1 release is going to be a actual kernel shipping with Windows, Linux kernel, excuse me. That's a new thing. Everything prior was a simulation riding on top of basically emulation of Windows libraries. So this is an actual 4.19 kernel that ships with Windows. So that's something that is in the pipeline. And the reason why it was really interesting to talk about this today is the name of the release is the Windows 10 May 2020 update, which would seem to indicate that it's going to be released relatively soon. But you don't have to wait for that. You can actually go get yourself on the insider's ring with Microsoft, and you can go on the slow ring. That's the conservative, just before they're putting it into the stable release branch. That'll allow you to access it. And so what you really need when you look at your Windows settings and properties, you need to see that your Windows build is greater than, I think there's technically it can be like a 19034, but the one that really was the stable, and I wouldn't go too much before, is the 19041, which I believe will be exactly the one that's coming out with May 2020 release. And so I also have some links in here as well. I will send these out after the presentation, but the link there that takes you to Microsoft's site. Let me see here. Let's take a peek if we dare.
Hey, Mark, before you jump into that,
sure.
we had 2 questions come through. The first one was somebody asked, will there be a recording of this meeting available? Yes, we are recording this, and we will have that posted afterwards. And then the second one is, Mark, have you heard any talk about whether everything's still on track for the May 2020 release with kind of what we've been going through? Is that still expected?
Yeah, from what I've heard, that has not slowed things down. I was trying to dig around a little more. Microsoft is also very, I mean, they tend to be really close to the vest when they get this close. And again, they're just being prudent. They have lots of people like me that are out there testing this right now. And I will say the release that we're on is the one I got in December. So, and they also switched all rings to this release. So what they call the fast and slow rings, those all switched over to this version in December. So they're driving everybody to test this on the platform. And by the way, here's the number, 18.917 is technically where WSL2 was added into the build. But like I said, the 19.041-ish is about where you want to be. So anyway, when you come in here, it's going to give you the instructions for going through and setting this up. That's going to be really important. There are some things you need to handle with respect to Windows getting it ready, and basically allowing it to use its virtual platform. And the thing that's super cool about this is when you go to fire up even a cold shutdown WSL instance, it happens within a second or two. So that's really sweet when you're firing it up. So basically it takes you to the WSL setup, and we'll go through some of this stuff in a couple minutes. But then there's links off to all of the other things that you might want to do for setting it up. So there'll be some links for that. Similarly, there is the Docker Desktop Edge, and Edge is simply so that it has the WSL2 features. They started this as a part of an early release program with Docker to push it out beyond just the Edge users, kind of a special early experience or technical preview late last fall, and it's been running ever since. So it's been pretty stable. I'd have to say there are a couple of pesky bugs. The ones I've heard about most recently have to do with with switching to Windows containers. Once you're running the WSL 2 version of it, it gets a little pesky. I'm sorry, I was just checking to make sure I wasn't missing anything here. And so, yeah, it's a pretty cool release. So what they have in the release that, again, presumably as soon as the Windows Subsystem for Linux is released, then Docker will move the Edge release and basically retag it as stable. But the integrates, again, with WSL2 directly. We'll take a look at what that sort of means and in a little more depth. And then uses the Linux kernel instead of Hyper-V Moby for your Linux images. So as you probably knew in the past, it actually would run, the way Docker would cheat to sort of run on a Windows operating system, it uses a kernel, right? So in the background, it would spin up a Hyper-V instance. That Hyper-V instance had something called Moby. Moby is like the minimal Docker kernel that you need to run Docker. So that's the way. There used to be a fair amount of moving parts. There were more networking things, and you didn't have direct access to it. So there were some things that really sort of teed off, I think, a lot of Linux developers. So other things are fixed in the file system. Previously, it was using Samba. As I say, Samba, rest in peace. I don't know about you guys, but I started using Samba at least 15 years ago. It served us well, but GPRC, the Fuse version for file system, is much more reliable in the fact that it provides you a richer set of services. One of the key things that you didn't get before reliably when you were working, particularly in Windows Subsystem for Linux 1, was if you had an update to the file system, you didn't get the notification. So if you were refreshing files, and you're actually going to see something with that today, that wouldn't have worked previously because the kernel never would have known that the file system was updated because the Windows emulator didn't do it properly. So anyway, so there's a roadmap that Docker provides. If you go out to GitHub, their Docker and then roadmap projects, you'll see where they are with all the things that they're developing. And for those of you who aren't aware, in November, Docker went through a big split. They essentially sold off their enterprise edition of Docker to a company by the name of Mirantis. Mirantis is a pretty heavy-duty open source infrastructure company, and they're using that to essentially be their kind of core Kubernetes platform that they're going to run on multiple environments. So I want to make sure I'm sorry, I'm looking at any chats here that might be questions or things, so please forgive me. But so long and short of it, the company split off the Docker, the remaining Docker company, which builds Docker Desktop, the community releases and things like that. And support the Docker open source community, has continued on. And I think it technically might be called Docker Next. That was the rumor I heard. I don't know where that is, but so we have the sort of the paid for stuff. A lot of that moved over. But Docker, the remaining Docker company that's really been focused really now on development experience, is doing some things using Docker Hub, Docker Build. They've got some Docker Actions at GitHub if you haven't checked them out. There's some pretty neat stuff that they're doing. But the Docker Desktop Community Edition, totally free, really nice product, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later. They do also have an enterprise version that's available through some other channels. And that's for large companies that have to deal with the desktop images, admin privileges, and the things that you might run into. So,
Mark, we did have a couple other questions come through. First one is simple. What does GPRC stand for?
It's the it's the remote. It's basically RPCs, the latest version of RPCs for remote procedure calls within Go, generally. So that's where I've generally seen it used. It's a more efficient. It's essentially, if you take a look at all the IPC that's running on most of the latest applications and software and within Kubernetes itself, it's using the GPRC framework. So you can look that up. It's not a trivial programming environment by any stretch. It's not for the faint of heart, but when it's wrapped on things behind the scenes, it's okay. So hopefully that's a satisfactory answer for everybody who wants. We can not only send you some links, but some links to tutorials as well for using it.
And then one other question. Somebody came in and asked and said that Samba had opened up a security hole on Windows machines and was curious if this will open up any new vulnerable ports on machines.
Well, it sure could. As far as I know, though, GPRC is really become the go-to, like I said, cross processing space. So when you start talking about, user land kind of applications in a secure way, so at pretty large scale. So I haven't heard anything about that. Samba, and by the way, the biggest problem with Samba was, as I pointed out, it was really old, and a lot of people left very old unpatched versions of it as well, laying around. But there were some, I know exactly, there was in WSL 1, when people were using the file mounts, there were some issues, potential issues. And I never heard of an exploit actually doing anything with it. But again, GPRC is kind of the next big step forward, again, from a performance perspective. And I can't answer, if it's opened any holes. I haven't heard of any at this point. But if we do, we're going to have some huge problems. But that said, I'm going to point out that there were some issues even within Kubernetes, patches that came out in the last 6 to 8 weeks. So, like all of this stuff, stay on top of patches, and particularly if you're using any vulnerability scanning, stay up to date with that. Would be my disclaimer. Any other questions?
And that's it for now.
All right, fantastic. So again, you can look at Docker's the community group, the Docker team's project roadmap is available there. So I encourage you to take a look. Very transparent, and you can post issues and do all the usual things you would do with a community project there. So, so VS Code. So for folks that haven't worked with this, where have you been? No, I'm just kidding. It's become extremely popular. And VS Code, for those of us that came out of some of the Microsoft world at one point in our career, we're used to Visual Studio, and we also see sort of the same thing for very rich for .NET side of Visual Studio, but we also see a lot of the heavy-duty IDEs for Java development in varying forms. Those are still going to be around. But when you start talking about web app development, or if you're a DevOps person, where I'm not going to be like doing deep debugging of those Java applications, I'm going to be building and running containerized applications. I don't need Visual Studio, and that's the beautiful part. If you're putting things in a container, containerizing them correctly, your entire tool chain is in the container, so it makes life a lot easier. So VS Code, the main thing for it, again, free. That's fun. Really designed around the web front end side, a lot of JavaScript. It's a Node app, I believe itself. So it's a very cool platform. But the biggest sort of advantage of it is the rich ecosystem. There are so many plugins, it's overwhelming. So that you can do that kind of, good or bad. But like if you stick to the ones that have more than 4 or 5 million downloads, you're probably in good company. But anyway, there's a lot of them out there. I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but there's some, it's massive ecosystem with a lot of adoption. So in going through your process of setting this up, again, you can use some of the links I gave you. You can also just Google this, but if you also go to the main instructions coming out of, if you look it up on Microsoft's site, they walk you through it pretty nicely. And again, the guide for that that will forward here. But you have essentially for WSL2, first of all, you want to make sure that you've enabled that virtualization, and then you install, in this case, the one that's the first distro that they're using. They're working on other ones, of course. Happens to be Ubuntu. It's like a Microsoft favorite. No one should be surprised by that. And again, it's a fine distribution. I think most of us are pretty used to various styles of package managers at this point if you've worked in Linux for a while. So anyway, so you want to be able to go through, enable it, set up, and install Ubuntu on your machine. You used to have to go through some painful measures to pull down ISOs and things like that. You can actually literally just get out of the Microsoft store to get your distro fired up, and then you can set it up. So you can have multiple distros and say which one is your default distro. When, for instance, you open up an Ubuntu shell, which I'll do in a minute here. The next thing is installing VS Code. So you install VS Code, and you make sure that you add in the remote WSL extension. So this automatically allows you to have even though your VS Code is running a Node app on Windows, you can actually communicate with the backend. We'll take a little deeper look at that in a moment. And then finally installing Docker Desktop Edge, and there are a couple things that I'll show you there that you want to make sure when you install Edge that you enable it. You still need to say, yeah, because it's an Edge release, there's some optional features, and one of those is WSL2, and you're going to want to turn that on. So I think that is, well, again, we'll take a look at it. Oh, the other thing too is after you install Docker Desktop Edge, all you need to do is essentially check a box to fire up Kubernetes. Okay, so I think those of you that have tried installing it various ways and keeping it up to date will enjoy that. So
Mark,
just from a, sure,
real
go
quick,
ahead.
we got another question that came through from one of our attendees who wrote, I am used to Linux programming on Cygwin and dual partitions. Is Docker a better way to Linux?
Well, I think WSL2 is a better way to Linux. The Docker piece is a better way to everything. And I say that for the people that have been working. I think the best way to sum this up, I've been working with this technology for probably 4 or 5 years at this point, pretty heavily. I have not ran into anybody that's started using it and went back. Okay, so let me ask you the first question. The first question is using Linux. The Linux experience with WSL2 it's very similar to what I'm used to with running on a Mac. Okay, so I just fire up an iTerm, boop, I'm there, it's up running. The difference here, though, is I can have multiple distros that are separate. If I kill that distro Linux, I'm not going to break my machine. So there are some sort of nice things about that. So I'm not sharing that. And I don't have to use any special virtualization and wait for minutes and maintain those big images and things like that. So again, Windows is doing that for you behind the scenes. So I think the experience from a Linux perspective is I would expect it for most people to be, it has been for me so far, on par what you would expect from just running on a Mac platform. With a couple of other potential benefits, because I can switch out my distros without having to install, again, another VM. So even though Windows is sort of quietly and quickly doing that for you, in essence, behind the scenes. So just makes it a little smoother. So the Docker piece, that Docker part is just really making it easier for you. Once I get my Linux command line, I've got Docker, right? Docker's up and running. So I can issue my Docker commands and do the things I'd expect to do, Docker build. And so those kind of things, Docker run. And the other part is Kubernetes. So I don't have to install anything else. So once I have this environment, I walk through the setup, I literally go in and I have a local Kubernetes cluster up and running. Okay, so and we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes and what that looks like from the Windows Subsystem for Linux perspective. But so this is kind of where the magic happens. So essentially, I know these arrows are going in a single direction, but what I'm going to show you is this is essentially a two-way street. There are agents on the in the WSL VM that are talking back to Windows and vice versa to make sure that essentially the state of your request gets basically marshaled and executed. So on the Windows side, the key thing to really understand is that when I'm running in Linux mode, my Docker commands are getting proxied across to the kernel and the Docker instance that's running in a virtual machine. And I'll show you what what it actually does behind the scenes in a minute. I'm not going to get into a ton of the technical details there, partially because they're pretty stable at this point, but they had been changing a little bit over time. But I'd like to give you guys just a kind of a little bit overview of the experience first. So, but anyway, so that's the high level piece. So if I'm in Windows, I can make a connection to my stuff that's running on my WSL, to my Linux world. If I'm in the Linux world, I can actually fire up code out of the environment I'm in. I'll show you guys. It'll explain itself. All right, so now now we're to the part where we can kind of take a look, right? So what does this mean? So first thing I'm going to do is talk a little bit about WSL2, and not to say, go into a whole lot, but when you have it set up, so most people would understand that if you're on a Windows machine that I have PowerShell, right? And so I'm going to take a look at my order is important here, and that's very frustrating for those of us that aren't on the Windows side of the world. So I have Windows Subsystem for Linux. I'm going to make this bigger if I can. Sorry about that. It's probably pretty small for you folks at home. Properties. And I haven't done this in a little bit. Please bear with me. All right, so now it's going to scroll off the screen and drive me crazy. But anyway, so what I did here is I just ran a WSL. So that's what you might think, Windows Subsystem for Linux command. And I said list my, basically my VMs that I have running, and then tell me what version they are. So remember I told you I had WSL 1 up and running before? That's this one right here, Ubuntu 18.04 that I had previously. Now I have my new version, which is from the store. The other one I manually installed. That's why it's got a little different name. I have Ubuntu running from the Windows store. Is there another question? Sorry, I thought I heard something. Okay. The other two things that are going on there are the Docker desktop and the Docker desktop data. So basically what it's using for the volume mounts, as well as where it's running the kernel. So that I don't, if I blow up my instance of Ubuntu or do something bad, I won't necessarily affect the Docker distribution, plus Docker can update their own code, etc. So just to understand, when I fire up Docker desktop, it's running at this point, it takes about 8 or 9 seconds. And that's also to start Kubernetes. Okay, that's pretty good. For those of you that have tried this other ways, it fires up pretty quick. And I'm on a Dell XPS 13. It's you know, like I don't know, like what does it say here? 8th gen i7 and 16 gigs of RAM. So it's not like a massively crazy box like the 15-inch ones we have now. But so again, to give you some approximation, maybe 6 to 8 seconds to fire that up. So then the question is, how do I get to it? So one of the things I can do is from the PowerShell terminal, I can actually just type WSL. It's going to take me to my default, which is the one with the asterisk up here, Ubuntu. Okay, so that's up and running. The colors are ugly, so you know generally I don't find myself working in this one. Of course, you can adjust those and also get into changing the prompts. But so I can also do a Docker info, and you'll notice a lot going on here. Okay, so on the client, I just have the basic client with a couple of plugins. I happen to be using Docker app for packaging applications. That's a totally different topic for another day, and also BuildKit. BuildKit for much faster builds and caching allows me to do some fun stuff, particularly if I'm building node-based applications for the repos or Maven applications. So anyway, but on the server side, there's 24 containers running. So it's like, well, what in the world, right? So one of the things on the Linux side, they're going to give you sort of the unvarnished view of the world. So actually, I'm going to go back to the PowerShell for a minute. I'm going to run Docker info here, and you know we still see that there's lots of containers running, etc. But let's do pretend I type Docker container ls, that I'm not lazy and just put Docker ps in. For those of you that have ever taken Docker training from me, you know that I like to give people a hard time about that. It's only showing one container running, okay? If I go back over to the Linux side, what are all these? Holy smokes. What this is Kubernetes, okay? These are all my Kubernetes containers running as a part of the kind installation that Docker uses, okay? So there's a bunch of things running in there. As I said, as you'd expect, the Linux world is going to give you sort of a different view. So that's kind of what the WSL from the command line from PowerShell looks like. And I'm just going to close that down a sec. Oops, I guess you have to use the whole word now. And now you notice over here I've got an Ubuntu. So I can fire this up, and again I can. Let's go to here. And some of the same fun here. And we'll go to 24 like I did before. I don't know what resolution and how the stuff's showing up. So again, Docker PS, I get all those Kubernetes containers. But the other thing now that I have running is Kubernetes. We'll come back to that in a second. So that is the Windows subsystem for Linux. I'm in here. If anybody has any Linux commands that they would like to see, you know, it's like the sort of the real deal. Okay, so that just to give you some idea there. So the next thing I'm going to look at is the Docker desktop. Okay, so Docker desktop installed here. And so what we see here are a couple of things. So as I pointed out, when you're setting this up, a couple just really quick reminders. Make sure you come in here and make sure that you use the WSL2 based engine. If you're using WSL2, of course. This is what we used to do to kind of expose our the daemon port to so I could get to it from the old Linux when it was running inside of a Hyper-V. It handles all the WSL integration, handles all the TLS encryption, so I don't have to worry about that. Resources. So down in the WSL integration, it's going to list your active distribution types that are on your machine. I happen to be using Ubuntu. As I said, they're working on some other distributions. I'm not aware if any other ones are ready yet. I really haven't been paying that close attention to this point. The Docker engine, this is stuff, everybody working with Docker, you should be familiar with this, right? So I can set my different parameters up. And then getting to command line, I happen to enable experimental features because there are a couple things I'm working with that I want to use that. The last part here is for Kubernetes. All I needed to do to get Kubernetes 16.5 running on my machine was check this box when I installed it. That's it, okay? And from there, Docker takes over. And so I can come over here and version, that's, whoopsie. So let's just spell it right. So the client version and then my server version that I am, oh, you want to know, so that looks kind of funny. I'm going to explain that in a second. And the reason is, let me also go do a kget nodes. I left myself connected to my cluster, my Docker Enterprise cluster running on and that is running 14.8. So we'll come back to running the desktop version in a minute. And again, I can come in here, I can do my kube control config, current context, set context, and set it up to and swap out my context to my other version. But I'll show you a little easier way to do that. So anyway, so that's kind of my the Docker desktop. One other thing that they added in here is this concept of their dashboard. So you can see my container that's running here. And so you can actually log into it or launch it. That's actually how I started the presentation that we're watching. This is running on localhost 8080, and I'll show you in a minute how that got there, okay? So Docker Desktop, VS Code. So obviously VS Code is installed on my machine just like it would be normally. The thing that you're going to notice differently when you have the WSL Connect, down here in the bottom left, you're going to see a remote. Okay, so that's going to basically show me where it's going to open to the last environment that you were in, which for me happened to be Ubuntu. Okay, so there's other plugins here, and we'll go through those in a little bit more detail in a minute. Let's see here. Just wanted to make sure we're staying on track here. Okay. So yeah.
Yeah, we have a couple questions that have come through. First, how does Atom compare to VS Code?
It's good. I just don't know about the plugin infrastructure. I definitely run into, I would say 3 or 4 years ago, I ran into more Atom. But I don't know, I'm not an expert on Atom. But I don't see as many people using it anymore, but there could be a lot of reasons for that. VS Code, I think, is kind of started to become the kind of 800-pound gorilla in that space.
Gotcha. Next question, does Linux run while Windows is running?
Yes. Yep, they're both running. They run side by side. It used to be where WSL1, where the Linux was an emulation layer on top of the Windows kernel. Now they actually are running side by side.
Great. Another one. Where is the directory in Linux stored, and how do you get your Linux files in Windows or Windows Linux?
Excellent question. I like it. So what I'm going to do to make that, so I started up VS Code over here a minute ago. I'm going to close it, okay? And so let's say that I was over here. So this is the normal setup, right? So I fired up, I'm in my home directory. That's obviously on the Linux side. If I go to, and if I look here, you're gonna notice everything looks pretty interesting, but I have this, what's this C thing? That's my C drive on Windows, okay? So I can do /C, /users, and then I'm gonna go to DC Dev, presentations, and let's go to the Docker demo. So this is where I happen to have the source code stored for the demo, or pardon me, for the presentation I was using today, Reveal.js. So what I'm gonna do, all I have to do to start this up, so this answers where the file system is, right? I'm on the Windows side of the world. And now I'm opening VS Code. And what it did from the Linux side is it actually launched the Windows process. This is gonna look a lot like we just saw before. And so we're there. So I don't know if I have a terminal open. I didn't open one. Just taking a second to start up. It's a little sluggish, which is weird. Anyway, so now I have one in that directory. One of my plugins wants something. So anyway, so to that point, if I came over here, and I'm not using Minikube, one of the Kubernetes plugin assumes that you're doing that. We can go to here, and then I can go to users, DC Dev, presentations, and there you go. So that's that. I'm in the same place. So that's the Windows File Manager. It's in dark mode. I hope that's not throwing anybody off. And then over here, I'm actually looking at it I'm in through the Windows subsystem for Linux, but I'm using the Windows mount, which is under, go away, right there. So C, users, and TC. So they're both available. And that's pretty straightforward, I hope. So what I wanted to do, so that everybody can understand how I started the presentation. So actually, just backing up, I intentionally put a typo in here. Okay, so if I was a developer, I'd say, hey, I need to fix my application, right? So just, I went through, I opened up my project in that particular directory, and I'm gonna put something in my way here, and then I'm going to come up here, and let's do. Okay, look at that. Oh yeah, boy, that's bad typing there. Huh? All right. All right, so we got that. Control S. So I save my file. And so a couple things I'm showing off here. One of the fact is I just did an update on my file system that was mounted into a container, and I'll show you in a second, inside of an Nginx container. If I go through and reload my page, look at that. Picked it up. So remember I talked about WSL2, the file handling, the notification. Essentially, my underlying application running in the container got notified that the file system had updated that I mounted, and I'll show you how we got to that. All right, so essentially, my application is running over here. I can look at, oops, so we're not going to go to that yet. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. So excited. So I'm going to look at the containers, and this Nginx container, which I fired up apparently a couple hours ago, I can actually, well, back it up a little bit. Let me look at the instructions for this. So when I look at how I run this, so in my repo, when somebody comes in and wants to run this presentation, all they do is run this command. So you don't have to worry about installing anything or doing anything. What I'm doing is pulling down essentially an image called just the standard Nginx image. Okay, oops, I switched out of preview mode apparently. And from there, so if anybody familiar with the Docker command, this is a Docker run. RM just means when I stop this container, get rid of the container that's lying around. I'm going to call it Docker Prez, and then I'm going to run it on my local machine. I'm going to bind it to 8080. That's going to forward port map into 80 inside the container. That's where Nginx is expecting that to be running. And then the key part here is I mounted my current directory, right? So my files, all these files that we saw in the box over here. So all of my JavaScript files and et cetera, index, and then pulling up the style sheets and everything else, that is all in this directory. And it gets mounted into my container. And if those of you who worked with Nginx know that this is where Nginx stores the HTML files by default. Also, I did it as a read-only mount as well, so that my container side can't write to my host file system. That's a really good best practice if you can get away with it, if you're not expecting the container to update. So I can do propagate updates from my local host into the container, but the other way around, I'm not letting it doing it. And then I'm running it when I fired it up in detached mode. And again, I'm using Nginx. Normally, you'd want to have a tag on there if you wanted to make sure that you had a particular version of Nginx. So I fired it up, got my container running. The container that I was showing is sitting right here, this Nginx container, and it's called, the name of the container is Docker Prez, which makes sense with the command, up 2 hours. And then I can, for instance, I can attach a shell. So down here, I now have a shell inside that container. So if I went to my user, let's just grab this guy quick. Oh, we should probably go CD to that. Or you know what, I'll just do add an awesome. So right there, that looks familiar. I'm inside the container. I went to the location where I mounted my local file system, and guess what showed up? All of these files. Okay, so in the container running Nginx, I mounted this local file system. Again, any changes I made showed up, and that's why I could just refresh on 8080, and I got the latest one running. Okay, so this is just like, that's part of the local Docker, hey, that's pretty cool kind of stuff. Are there any questions about that? If there are, please send them over to John about any of the magic sort of going on there. So, but anyway, so the point is, I got my presentation fixed. It's up. We're running on port 8080 on my local host. I did not have to do, because I'm using Docker Kubernetes, I did not have to set up any port forwarding on my machine like I would with a Minikube setup, because again, it's part of my running environment. It's not a separate isolated container that's not integrated with the platform. So pretty cool stuff for those of you that have worked through this other ways. So the other thing I wanted to talk about was running a little more complicated application. So what I'm going to do, so a couple of things that are fun with the Docker extension here, right? So I can go over here and I can stop my container, right? So I don't have to, if I wanted to, I can also do, something over here. Sorry about that. Let's see, Docker PS Prez. So I could get my container ID here and do a Docker rm-f and just hit that. And that would stop my container from running. Or I could come up to the Docker window here and I could just right click on that and just say stop the container, right? So my command down below here is gonna have the same effect. A stop on this, because I did a --rm, is gonna remove it anyway. So anyway, that is kind of it. I'm gonna leave it running, and the reason is because I want my presentation to stay here. It shouldn't interfere with anything. So we're gonna pop out of here. So I'm now gonna leave my VS Code environment. Now I'm going to head over to CD. So I'm going to go to my microservices demo directory, and now I'm going to fire code up again. So we'll see how this all comes along. All right. So this is normally where I'd be buying myself some time asking how many people, raise your hands if you've worked with Kubernetes. It's a little clunkier to do virtually, but that would be the general idea. So what I am doing here is I have gone and created indexing my Terraform templates. Thank you so much. So by the way, I have a lot of other plugins here that I use that I've hidden, only because I didn't want to, make you cringe. But if you see alerts coming up and they don't line up with what you see here, and that's the reason. So anyway, so over here, I basically have a Kubernetes. I think some people might be familiar with the sock shop demo that we had put together. And so one of the things I did was I just cloned that repo, and then I went through because I noticed they had some problems. And what they had is it was outdated. And so there is a PR out there to fix it. So I had to come in here, and you'll see, some of the lines, some of the adds and deletes over here. But I had to basically update some of the API versions for deployments. It was still using extensions and the beta version that doesn't work or fly with the current version of Kubernetes. So long and short, I made some modifications. And then there's one other area in here that I want to show you. And also so that I can just double check. And that's my Ingress. Okay, so what I'm doing, first time, I'm just going to deploy this on my local Kubernetes cluster. And when I do that, I'm just going to come in and I'm just going to hit the endpoint of this service. And we'll be able to test it out and take a look at it. Okay, so we'll see. And the first time we run it, let's see here. The other thing I wanted to look at, and I'm just looking at our time here too. But anyway, so for a local deployment, I just want to take this and create this as a node port for my front end service, but so that I can just use the port number to access it. So, but I just noticed something that will be a little more interesting there. So, and this is some live programming, folks. And come on. Can't remember about my capitalization. This isn't one I use a lot. And oh, I'm in ports, sorry. This would be fun if I didn't have this opportunity. So let's come into here. Let's fix our front end deployment up here. And of course, it did a nice little, there we go. I'm in the ports description. That is not going to work for those of you following along at home. So, all right. You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to go back here. So there's a couple of good things to do here. One of them is I'm going to make sure I don't screw this up. And what I'm going to do is, anybody else use version control? So what I should be able to do here is go back and open and look at my changes. And one of the things that we are going to see is my piece I needed. So my apologies for this, but this is again what makes it authentic, right? So you see the changes I had to make for the old version. That would not deploy. And here we go. Type node part. I got to say I was damn close. Okay, so I am going to grab this section under the spec down to the selector. Go back to my source code. And all right. All right, so the idea here is that I should be able to take this and deploy this locally. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it to our, deploy it on the remote cluster. So the first thing I have to do is come into here and tell it, use my desktop as my current cluster. As you saw, it was using this UCP one out that runs on AWS, or actually it runs at our data center in Chicago. Then I'm going to come down here. And so when I go through and set this up, it should go and create a sock shop. Back up to the top here. First thing to do is create this namespace for sock shop, and then it will go and deploy my application. So we have this here. So let's go and fire up a terminal, which you can see is just a quick, it's Control-Shift backtick, and that opens up my terminal. Now what I'm going to do is actually run this file. So to do that, I'm going to come over here just to show a few things with using VS Code here. So I'm going to come in here and I want to get my copy my relative path into here, and I'm going to say. So by the way, kube control is just K for me. I just alias that unless I can type a lot. Apply -f. So what I'm going to try to do is locally take this and stand it up and deploy it. You see it's creating a few entities there. If you're not familiar with the sock shop application, I believe it's 12 different services that get fired up in a variety of different stacks, including Java, Node, there's Mongo databases, all kinds of cool stuff. So now that I got that started, go back to my Kubernetes plugin over here, and we're going to start to come over to workloads. And let's take a look at deployments. And, let's see what our namespace is. Let's do a refresh. Hopefully, we see our new namespace over here. So let's use that one. Let's refresh. And we come over here for workloads, deployments, and so I can see the different deployments that are starting to come up. And this is green, and it's up and running. And over here, what I did is I just asked it to get all. It knew because I'd set my namespace. It's basically scoping all my commands here to what I have set up for my kube cluster there. So those folks that haven't worked with that basically set me to my remote, or to the local cluster. It's like we're still waiting for the carts database to come up, and the sock shop database. So it looks like everything's up. So everything's up and up to date. And so what we have to do is, let's see, get SVC. Should have a node port service. Here we go. So on 3001, or 30,001, excuse me, I should be able to come to my browser and do a local host. Right. Looks like I've done that before. And look at that. We've got a sock shop application up and running. Let me go, my browser's a little probably tight for you guys. And I can register myself, go through and do all that fun stuff. Let it just fill some stuff in and get me registered. So notice there was a problem with register internal. So one of the issues that it's having is that it's trying to send it across a insecure connection. Okay, so that is a little bit of an issue. So what we want to do is let's go take this, modify this. So by the way, we're back inside of here. Everything's up and running. So let's go and pull our our local sock shop down from our local cluster here. And yeah. And the other thing I was going to say when this comes up, and we can do a it's going to take a second or two. So what I'm going to do while that's going on, I'm going to go through and make a slight modification to our setup here. And Ingress. All right. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm coming up here. And if I were smart the first time I did this, I would have toggled my line command here. And okay. And in VS Code, there's just a single thing you do for that. And I obviously don't need the spec for node port if I'm not using one. And okay, and then, okay, so I change it. So by default, if I don't say node port, it's going to use a cluster IP service, which is what I want. And what I want to do is I'm going to uncomment this stuff, because what I want to do is I want to use, when I put it out to my cluster, I want to use something called an Ingress Controller. And that Ingress Controller, let me get I'll just do the easy way, toggle up the line comments. So I've set it up so my incoming traffic that comes into sockshop.nvisia.io, that's my wildcard domain, will get picked up by the Kubernetes Ingress Controller and forward the traffic from 8079 here into this cluster IP on 8079. So let's save that. Let's go to, let's switch clusters. By the way, one thing I wanted to do over here was get nodes. So if you noticed, I just wanted to make sure you guys knew that that really was my local desktop cluster I deployed to. So now I'm going to come up over here and I'm going to do a set cluster, and then I'm going to open it up. And so if I come over to this one, first of all, I want to point out, give it a second, that's running remotely. There's no sock shop namespace there. So my application is not deployed out there. By the way, if I run this command again, looks different because I switched over to my other cluster. That's kind of fun and easy when you're working with a lot of clusters. A lot of people are like, well, which one am I on? This sort of helps that a little bit in that sense. But now what we're going to do is we are going to, I think I saved everything. You guys, anybody see any mistakes here? Please jump in and join the group coding. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my apply again. So this time I'm connected to the remote cluster and I've added in an Ingress controller. So nothing, so that all that means, everyone, is we just validated. So against the API on the other machine, we don't know that anything's running yet. We don't know what's going on. So let's go over here and look. There we go, sock shop is there. I'm going to set that as my namespace. It's warning me over here that I switched. That's very kind of it. And then I'm going to do a can get all in my name, that namespace. And it's still coming up. There's still a couple. It's got to pull the images down. So it's got to go to the registry and pull those images down. On my local machine, they were cached. So that went a little quicker. So we'll give it, we want to see all of them ready here. Wow, okay, we're getting closer. So as soon as that comes up, what I should be able to do is I should be able to come over here. Okay, now this one won't work anymore because I took that instance down. It'll just sit there and spin and basically said it couldn't get anywhere. So now we're going to go HTTPS. And then I'm going to say sockshop.nvisia.io. And we'll give it a minute because I don't know that everything's up yet. One more check. And look at that, we got everything ready. So in theory, drum roll, please. Okay, so a couple fun things. You'll notice it's now secured. All right, So our infrastructure automatically handles that with a wildcard certificate. And it's been deployed out to that machine. And again, even though it's running on a remote box, the machine here, again, I can come down, I can look at my workloads, deployment, and I can take a look at my, any of these, I guess front end's as good as anything. And I can come to here. And again, I can, if I have permissions, I happen to be admin if you saw how I connected to the cluster, so I'm mighty. I can fire up a terminal into that remote box. So I'm now, from my local desktop, going out to a Kubernetes cluster that's running in our Chicago data center inside the pod that's running the front end. And it's running NPM, and that's how that's a Node.js application running. So that's kind of the fun tour there. So any questions about that? Because I just did some fun stuff there. That was pretty much all I wanted to show, and I wanted to open things up for questions or grill the presenter, whatever you guys want to do.
We did have a few questions come in. I know we're 10 minutes over our allotted time, but we'll answer a couple of them, and then maybe a couple of them we can maybe send out afterwards in responses.
Sure.
First that came through a little bit back was there are many ZSH integrations with Docker and Kubernetes, such as the ones included with iTerm2 plus ZSH. Are we able to replicate similar functionality with WSL to save some time with heavy Kubernetes debugging?
I have not worked with ZSH. So if you're talking about remote Kubernetes debugging, I'd ask that person to ask like what typically you're debugging, because you have access to everything from your command line. I mean, based on your privileges, of course. So are they talking about like sort of telepresence sort of things, like running local things and connecting them to remote clusters? I'm not sure exactly what the question is.
Okay.
So ZSH, I've heard of it. I just have not worked with it, so I'm not going to pretend there.
Another one, WS2 is using Hyper-V, so we're not able to work in parallel with Oracle VirtualBox. Do you know any easy way to move VirtualBox VM to WS2, or is there another solution to transfer VirtualBox activity to WS2?
Well, I'd ask what you're running with in VirtualBox, and do you really need to do it anymore? Or do you want to start up another WSL2 instance and run what you're running there? I'm not sure what images are running inside of those VMs, those VirtualBox images. Yeah, you can only have one that's absolutely true. You can only have one hypervisor type running in Windows, which is going to be Hyper-V in that case. So I guess if you're running Linux VMs, you can run separate VMs using WSL2, install multiple instances, and then you can just basically connect to them using the WSL command. You do basically WSL and then the VM instance, and you can pop right in there. And again, the cool part is that the startup is, in my experience, has been like less than a second. So again, the answer is maybe if it's Linux stuff. If you're doing other, other kinds of images, I wouldn't be sure. So.
Got it.
I wish we had actual people talking to us, because sometimes I need a little more feedback. I'm really sorry, guys and gals.
You know, Mark, we can actually unmute people if we wanted to.
Yeah, if somebody's dying, can they raise their hand? How do they do that? Or just chat you?
Let's see here. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question live.
Yeah, I'd much prefer that.
I'm helping John out on the moderation. Sorry, John, I chimed in here from the tech support. Doesn't look like anybody quite yet, Mark, but we have. I know we do have a lot of other questions that John is wanting to ask.
Okay, one more. I think we can get. Are you required to use YAML, or is there a JSON version of the same configuration?
For the Kubernetes manifest files? So for the Kubernetes manifest files, generally it's JSON. I mean, it's YAML, but you can output it as JSON. But when you're, generally applying it, I've seen, and I know this is sort of a sensitive thing for people. I mean, the indentation sensitivities within YAML, you definitely want a good editor when you're working with YAML. But most of the container orchestration pieces are, work kind of in a native YAML piece. There are ways to convert the configurations back and forth, but honestly, I've seen most people work just plain in just in YAML because it's the native format, at least for ingesting the API configurations, or even the API, the manifest, the resources that get fed to the API spec.
Great. I guess we'll close here at about quarter after. So let's ask one more.
Okay.
Are you able to remote into the Linux from another Linux box?
So yeah, if you have to have the SSH turned on, right? But yeah, other than that, it's regular old Linux. Yeah. So you have to make sure. Let's see. I have done. It's been a while since I've done that. Now, just trying to think. There used to be a minor. There used to be some. It was the IP, getting the IP essentially of the box. That I believe is the trickier part. But there's a very easy way to work around that. I can't remember it off the top of my head. But yeah, you have to get essentially the IP that has been assigned to that VM, and it's so if we go in here, if I do like an IP, the way it's connected to the adapter. Oh, and it's also using IPv6 as well. 172. So yeah, the thing is what the IP of the box is depends on the adapter. And the adapter, for instance, if you're in a laptop, some of those, the bridge may move around. So that there is actually though, a PowerShell command you can use to get the interface for a distribution. So the answer is yes, but it's not like you have a fixed IP. That's my only warning to you. So you can get there.
Great. Well, we are at about quarter after. I do want to be conscious of everybody's time. Mark, thank you so much for the presentation today.
You're welcome. Yeah, just want to give everybody a little tour. Glad to do it.
Really great stuff. And thank you everybody for your questions. There were a couple or a few other questions that we had that I'll share with Mark. And when we send out the recording at some point tomorrow of the presentation, maybe we can include a couple answers to those questions. Please feel free to reach out to us at any time if you have any questions about this stuff, or as I said at the beginning, if you have any interest in either presenting a topic about something you've completed or done, or a project, or if you have any ideas or thoughts about things you'd love to hear more about, and we can find somebody to put together a presentation similar to what Mark did here.
Yeah, and by the way, if anyone else has, along with questions, if you have anything else you want to post about like responses I gave to questions, if you have ideas or better answers, I'm all open. That's why I don't like this format. I like to engage people because I don't know every answer. And so having people be able to participate that way, that's what these meetups are about. So if you have any things you'd like to respond, please feel free to go out to the Docker Meetup group and post any things out there. And we can have discussions there as well as, like John said, on the follow-up.
For sure. We do the best we can in this state of the world that we are right now.
Yeah, it is hard without people being in the same room. But I appreciate everybody taking the time.
Yeah, thank you everybody for coming out, and we'll be releasing in the next week or so our next presentation. So thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your night, and thanks for coming.
Fantastic. Thank you.